in the 1990s, and honestly even the 2010s. So Anne Ting is a woman whose parents were Christian missionaries. So she was actually born in China, and she did live in a lot of different countries throughout her childhood. Eventually, she did come back to the United States, her parents' home country, and she went to Harvard, becoming one of the first women to graduate in their architecture program. Now recall, at the time, Harvard was being directed by Walter Gropius, the guy that said women cannot think three-dimensionally. But Anne Ting became top of her class, and she had these really interesting ideas when it came to structure, geometrics, and that's really going to be what defines her body of work. Anne Ting is obsessed with modularity, with triangles for the most part, so her work is really characterized by its geometrical forms. When she graduates, she decides to go sit for the licensing exam because she's ready, she knows everything she has to know, and the proctor turns her down because she's a woman. So she has to go back the next year, and then she's finally allowed to take it, becoming the only licensed woman in the state of Pennsylvania for that year. That same year, she goes into Louis Kahn's office. Now at this point, Louis Kahn isn't really a recognized architect, he's just kind of your average run-of-the-mill designer. And they start creating things together. On the side though, Anne Ting is making things of her own. So though she works in an office as part of a design group, she does continue to have independent works. And this is a part of the reason why we know where a lot of the ideas that became associated with Louis Kahn actually came from Anne Ting. So she designed this thing called the Ting Toy, which is essentially a group of flat panel plywood pieces that you can assemble in a number of different ways. So it can be a desk, it can be a little horse, a cart, and the idea behind this is again modularity. So we know she's one of the first people that think about architecture as being multifunctional, and the idea that a space can transform to be different things because of the way in which she assembles or the way in which she approaches a toy design. She also submits for an architecture competition for an elementary school. Now, if you notice, the plan is really heavily geometric, and it's quite unique. It didn't end up winning, but it is a good record of what Anne Ting was working on at the time. Now, because the classrooms and the blocks are all triangles, you can imagine that it's very difficult to furnish them. Did anyone here go to any of like the circle middle schools like Cashman or Brindley? So you'll know that when you don't have a square or a rectangular room, it is super difficult to furnish it because you have these weird empty like negative spaces that are created. So Anne Ting goes the extra mile, and she doesn't just design the building, she designs how the classrooms will be arranged and then how the desks are going to sit within that classroom. So she creates triangular furniture, and if you've ever seen those like fancy private schools, you'll know that this is the type of desk that they use, the triangular ones that you can bring together as hexagons or that you can have independently in order to form different types of groups. So she was an early proponent of modularity in education. And she also designed the structural system for it. Now keep in mind that this is a space frame, meaning that it's not just a truss, but it's a three-dimensional truss, which is super difficult to calculate. So Anne Ting isn't just an artist, she's also an engineer. And she's doing things that are far, far, far beyond the capabilities of most architects at the time period. So in their first major commission, they win the Yale Art Gallery, and they win because the ceilings in particular have a really nice look to them where the lights are recessed, they are not front and center. If you look at most museums, they have like black track lights that are kind of distracting. So the jury really liked that the lighting and all the systems were hidden in the ceiling system, and I think you can see very clearly that this is being directly influenced by Anne Ting's style. Prior to this, Louis Kahn did not have any work that had strong geometrics like this. But he soon begins to be recognized for this work, and he becomes associated with this style. Right, so there's a detail of the ceiling, and then here's a section where you can see that they are hollow on the top portion, and so you can run ducts, electricity, and plumbing through the ceiling without anyone ever having to see it, and you get this really, really beautiful, clean, artistic expression on there. Now, Ann Ting continues developing her own ideas, again, outside of the firm, and one of those is what she calls the City Tower. Philadelphia at this time period was still going through its City Beautiful movement. They were thinking about what the expression of the city would be for the 20th century, and she proposes this tower, which we can see has an exoskeleton. So remember that what that means is the structure runs on the exterior of the building rather than on the interior. So we really free up the floor plates on the inside, and now the structure is just on the outside, and it's becoming this really beautiful mathematical expression. Now, later down the line, this does become recognized as a really outside of the box, innovative approach to engineering. And it's invited to a MoMA gallery, so Museum of Modern Art. It's invited to New York City to be displayed, where Louis Kahn makes sure that her name is nowhere to be seen. He puts his name on it. It is now solely attributed to Louis Kahn. Like I said, recent scholarship is beginning to unearth a lot of these truths. So today we know it is actually Ann Ting's idea, but for a long time, people did believe that it was the genius of Louis Kahn that was responsible for all of these mathematical pieces, even though he didn't actually know how to calculate them himself. Now, eventually they do start to get involved romantically, which is really messy because Louis Kahn is 19 years her senior and he is married. So she gets pregnant, and in order to hide the scandal, she is sent away to Rome by him so that none of his contemporaries will ever know that she was his lover. At the time, she had actually just been awarded the Fulbright Scholarship, which she intended to pursue despite her pregnancy, but he didn't allow her to do it because, again, he was trying to hide it from the American media. So Ann Ting goes to Rome, and she works under this engineer's office, Pier Luigi Nervi, and you can see the appeal of his work to her because it's also rooted in strong geometrics, and so she's this really valuable asset when she gets there. She has her baby, she works for a year, and eventually she comes back to the United States, and much to her surprise, Louis Kahn is having a romance with another 20-year-old female, and I don't think he gets her pregnant, but he does get another woman pregnant after the fact. So it's a very messy office, but despite all of this and their personal relationship souring, she does continue to have a professional relationship with him as one of the partners in the firm. Now at this point, things are starting to not go so well between the two of them. She is becoming a much stronger and vocal designer. She is advocating for herself, and oftentimes it is her ideas that the client favors over his ideas, which he didn't really like. So the last project that she ever worked on was Bryn Mawr's dormitories for students. The design on the left is her proposal. The design on the right is Louis Kahn's. So what happens is, the client's sort of indecisive, and he goes, I don't know which one I want to pick because both of them are so interesting. We can see her geometric, mathematical modularity appear in plan once again. Her idea was that as there's more and more students, you can begin to expand this plan, and now it looks like she's working with octagon shapes. Louis Kahn's idea, on the other hand, has much more of a rigid geometry to it. So both of them are really amazing concepts, and because of that, the client doesn't know which one to select. On the day that they go to present their final models so that the client can decide which one he wants, Ann Ting is waiting in the office, and Louis Kahn walks in with his model, and he leaves hers in the car so that she isn't able to present. And that's basically the final straw for her. She quits on the spot, and she goes on to do her own thing. So she claims in this manifesto she wrote that the greatest hurdle for a woman in architecture today is the psychological development necessary to free her creative potential. To own one's own ideas without guilt, apology, or misplaced modesty involves understanding the creative process and the so-called masculine and feminine principles as they function in creativity and male-female relationships. So she begins advocating for herself. She goes on to gain a doctorate degree in architecture and teach at the University of Pennsylvania. And in this same region of the university, she builds her own house. And I think you can all tell which one of these is Ann Ting's house simply from looking at the roof. She continues to manifest her geometric ideas into her own home, and it becomes this lifelong project where her and her daughter live together. Again, Louis Kahn didn't really recognize his daughter since she was born outside the marriage. So Anne Tang is a single mother, a professor of architecture, a doctor, and she begins working on her house. From the outside, run-of-the-mill home, you wouldn't really suspect what's about to go on inside of here. But in sections, she does begin to play a little bit with the structure. So on the roof, we can see she begins to deconstruct it, which is why we see these triangular geometric pieces begin to pop out. And then on the interior, we begin to see her cutting out and deconstructing that roof in order to have these skylights. On the top level, we do see her drafting table. She did continue to submit for competitions for the rest of her life. She did a lot of these on her own, by hand. This is her staircase, which is actually storage units, so you can pull these out and have things inside of them, which shows just how modular her thinking is. On the corner of her house, she has this tiny little jewel-shaped bathroom, and then she has this really interesting fireplace that just kind of peeks out right where the staircase begins. So it's sort of an experimental grounds for her to play with all these ideas that she was never able to fully manifest in other projects. So in Anne Tang's example, we do begin to see the idea of the post-war woman in architecture, someone who is allowed to pursue their education and practice in the field openly, but still faces barriers and is overshadowed, not just by her boss, Louis Kahn, but also by the person who didn't allow her to sit for her exam, or the professors who did not allow her to become tenured, despite being a doctor and having all the qualifications to become a tenured professor. And she's someone that practiced in all three disciplines as well. And in all three, she was screwed over. So at this point, we see women are accepted, they can join, but it doesn't mean that they'll always have an easy time or have recognition. All right, now the next partnership. So this one is actually my favorite, which I think you'll see why. Ray and Charles Eames. Ray and Charles Eames are a design partnership that does not just do architecture. They are mostly known for furniture, patterns, films. They do anything and everything together. Ray Eames began as an abstract artist in New York City. So this is the type of art that she was creating. She was actually a founding member of the American Association of Abstract Artists. And look at the pops of color, blue, red, and yellow. So keep these in mind because we will see that they will permeate into her work with Charles Eames. And some of her inspirations are going to be Mondrian, which you should also keep in mind, and then Picasso. And we can see that Mondrian has this very geometric approach with bright primary colors. So at some point, she decides that the place to be is California. California is now becoming the heart of modern architecture, so she decides that that is the place where she wants to go. On the way, she does stop by this place called Cranbrook Academy for Artists, which is headed by the Saarinen family at the time. And her future husband, Charles, teaches here. He teaches industrial design. If you're not familiar with that discipline, they basically design anything and everything. Anything from a chair to a water bottle to a monitor. They really just find the most ergonomic shapes for things. So Charles is at the head of those studios, and they meet each other, and it's sort of this instant click. And together, they decide to go to California, they get married, and they start the Eames studio. So this is them shortly after their wedding, once they arrived in California, in Venice Beach. Now, originally, their office is called the Charles Eames office, but he begins to notice really quickly that by having his first name in there, the implication is that everything that goes on in the office is going to be Charles's work, when in fact it was 50-50. So he makes a decision really early on to remove his first name, and it becomes known simply as the Eames office. And it is because he made decisions like these along the entirety of his career that Ray Eames's name is so well known, and she's so well documented today, because he consistently gave her credit any opportunity he got. So Ray Eames began working on some other endeavors while she was on the beach. She created some patterns which today continue to be used for furniture. If you look at a lot of decorative pillows, they continue to use these patterns as well. And we can see her influences from abstract art begin to get into the world of textiles. And she also begins designing furniture pieces alongside her husband. So So these are some clay models we know were made by her, and then the final design piece. Now what you'll notice is that in comparison to Charlotte Perriand and Lily Reich, their style is rooted more in plywood and wood materials. At the time there was a scarcity in metals because of World War II, so they did have to use wood and get creative with how they were going to use it. And they created this thing called the Kazan machine. And then Charles created this funny little sketch that says, "Keep out of the Kazan because you'll be electrocuted." So this thing was an absolutely crazy contraption. It relied on so much energy that when they plugged it into their apartment, it caused a blackout on the whole block. And then all the residents were mad at them. So Charles decided to go to the transformer on the block and literally plugged into the actual city grid, which is super dangerous. If you don't do it correctly, you're gonna die from electrocution. But he did it. And for a long time, they started practicing with the Kazan machine to make pieces like these. So the way it works is you grab small, really thin pieces of plywood, you put them into the machine, you press them with heat, and eventually you get things that look like this. So we can begin to see the origins of ergonomic furniture made with wood. And their idea was we want to cut down on the number of pieces so that assembly is easier, so that it can be more widespread, so that people will purchase it more often, and it will be just easier to produce in general. They begin playing with other ideas, so we see that just like Anting, the Eames also start creating toys, and they create this cute little elephant toy, and Charles Eames does famously say that toys are not as innocent as they look because they were actually the prelude to serious ideas. And he's not wrong. The ideas that they put into a toy elephant are the same ideas that go into making some of the most iconic furniture of the 20th century. Now, because the war is going on, not many people are interested in furniture, so what they actually go into is wood splints. So the US Navy commissions 500 pieces because prior to their invention, which looks like this, wood splints were literally just 2 pieces of wood, which creates a lot of pressure on the knee when they're tied together, and it doesn't really evenly distribute the pressure on the rest of the leg. So it's painful, it's not as efficient, and the Eames designed the leg splint to form to the human leg, so that now the healing process will not only be more comfortable, but it'll also be a lot quicker. And soon the British learned that they're making these really interesting pieces out of wood, and they commissioned them to start making whole pieces for their Air Force. So these are gonna be pieces that go into the aircraft that was being used during World War II, and notice that it's also made out of plywood because of the scarcity in metal resources at the time. Now, once the war is over, with all the money that they earned on these pieces, they can go back to doing what they actually like. Charles Eames is named the head of Herman Miller. Is anyone familiar with that name? Yeah, so Herman Miller is like the name of furniture designs. Today, it continues to be a luxury brand, and most people want to obtain original Herman Miller pieces, specifically because Charles and Ray Eames' ideas are a part of those collections. So he's the director, and everything that he creates is done in partnership with Ray. He does not design at the office, he designs at home with her. And they create pieces like this. I'm sure everyone has seen this chair. They create this one, which I'm sure all of you have also seen. And the campaign behind that is actually a really funny series of photographs where they look like they're being pinned to a wall. They're actually just lying on the floor, but they take the frames of the chairs without the plywood piece in order to show how easy it is to put this together, right? It's really just 3 pieces. So it's easy for anyone to construct. They also start creating pieces like this. And this is where we see Ray's abstract influences start to come in the form of color, blue, red, yellows. And then the most famous piece of all, the Eames lounge chair. I'm sure all of you have also seen this one. They might be very common looking and you might say, yeah, that's kind of everywhere, but what's important is this is literally the blueprint. This did not exist prior to Charles and Ray Eames, and we know that because they invented this specific technique. And today it's still one of the most comfortable pieces that you could ever buy. Now eventually their designs get out there, the names become quite recognized, and they get commissioned, well Charles gets commissioned, a case study house. Is anyone familiar with the case study movement? So in the 50s, LA decided to host this competition of sorts where the biggest architects in the United States were designed or were commissioned small home designs, and the idea was that the homes were made for families of 1 child, 2 children, common family units, and that they would become the homes of tomorrow. So today, a lot of celebrities do own these in the LA Hills because they are a symbol of mid-century modern in the United States. They honestly didn't really catch on just because even with the designs they proposed and how affordable they could be, it wasn't really accessible for the majority of Americans yet. But Charles Eames and Arrow, his old friend from Cranbrook, get commissioned this site, and they create what is going to become Case Study House number 8. So the house itself is this block over here. Notice the topography lines moving beneath it so that it's actually a cantilever home. So this is the original plan for the house. Now, because, once again, resources are still running low after the war, they do have to wait it out before they gain the materials in order to build this, and by that time, Arrow decides to drop out. He's doing all sorts of things on the East Coast. And so Ray Eames enters the picture, and together they decide to transform the house from being something that traverses the terrain to something that instead follows the terrain up here. And they cut it into 2 pieces. And we get the famous Eames house. So once again, on the facade, red, yellow, and blue, the iconic Mondrian and Ray Eames colors. They split the home into 2, and this is supposed to be a concept for a couple that doesn't have children and works from home. So on the left, we have the actual home, and on the right is their design studio. After living on this site for a while, they realized that the cantilever idea wasn't going to work because it didn't allow the user to really connect with nature. So that's why they decided to turn it and place it to work with the topography rather than be over the topography itself. Today, a lot of the greenery has grown out, and so this is what the Eames house looks like. On the inside, all of the furniture pieces, the millwork, all of it was designed by both of them together. And you can see that the way in which they designed their walls is really unique. It's a series of curtains that you can pull back so that the house itself transforms. There they are together in their home. There is the famous Eames recliner. There is our beautiful staircase. And what I want you to notice is look at how crisp these photographs are, right? Compared to Anne Ting and Marion Mahoney, it was so difficult to find pictures for them because they just were not well documented. But when it comes to Ray Eames, it's very rare to see a picture of just one of them by themselves. They always come as a pair, and he always insists to anyone that is doing any media on them that they always include her name and her image if they are taking photographs. This is their design studio, 2 stories. It's not just a drafting office, it's also a development for film. It's a room for film development in the back over here. They have places to create textiles on the 2nd floor. You can see a little bit of their architectural models. So it's really a workshop that does all sorts of things. And for the rest of their lives, Charles and Ray Eames will go on to create architectural pieces. This is them creating small movies. This is them developing their film together. This is an example of one of their films. So once we get to the film week, I'll show you some of the movies that they created on their own. And famously, Charles Eames always said, anything I can do, Ray can do better. Anytime anyone asked him what her role was in their design process. And so in Ray Eames, we see a partnership that always emphasized equality, and because of that, she is today one of the most recognized modernist designers of the 20th century. But that didn't just happen by coincidence. It did take a lot of work by Charles to consistently include her, even when the people that were documenting their work didn't want her to be in there. He insisted, if you put my name in there, she has to be in there too, because this is a 50-50 endeavor. So it's really showing the importance of advocacy in our profession and the importance of speaking out when you see that something is wrong. lastly, we will talk about Denise Scott Brown and Robert Vittori, quite possibly the most controversial couple in the world of architecture because of how outspoken the both of them were to the injustices that were done towards Denise Scott Brown. So, Denise Scott Brown and Robert Vittori are an interesting case study for 3 reasons, and I want you to keep these in mind as we go through the lecture. So first of all, their partnership is rooted in practice, research, and academia. They do all 3 things together, and in all 3, Denise Scott Brown's name tends to be left out, at least in the early decades. Number 2, they are a prime example of why the star system is a problem. And number 3, they are one of the final generations of partnerships, that we see in the 20th century. For a reason. We've seen that these don't really work out that well. So let's start with Denise. Like Anne Tang, Denise is actually a sort of traveling person for a long time. She was born in Africa in what was known as Rhodesia at the time, which is modern-day Zambia. And she studied in South Africa, where she met her first husband, who was interestingly also named Robert. And his name was Robert Scott Brown, which is where she gets her last name, Denise Scott Brown. They set out to travel the world, and the both of them want to become architects. So they both go to University of Pennsylvania, where they study, both of them gain their master's degrees. Unfortunately, Robert does die in a car crash, so she is left as a widow. But while she's there, she does meet Robert Vittori, and the 2 of them click when it comes to their intellectual ideas. For a long time, they practice as professional partners at the university, and eventually they fall in love and they do get married. Now notice Denise is already a woman that isn't really the average woman just by looking at her wedding dress, which is full of words. I tried to decipher what it says, but I couldn't really read it. But we know that, she's not the traditional type of woman for the time. So before marriage, I do want to highlight that Denise had all of these achievements under her belt. She was, first of all, a tenured associate at an Ivy League, which was UPenn. She later gets invited to be an architect and professor at Yale, so now she has 2 Ivy Leagues under her belt. She's also a professor at UC Berkeley, which is practically an Ivy League. She is the youngest amongst all her fellow professors, including the ones that are men, and she is the favorite amongst all of her students. She's a published writer by this point, and she is one of the founders of UCLA's architecture program. So Denise is a very, very well-accomplished individual prior to marriage. But as soon as she gets married, she starts noticing that she gets reduced to being Robert Vittori's wife. And everything that she does, people begin to assume is actually Robert Vittori's work. And she gets asked, or rather he gets asked and told, oh, Denise Scott Brown wrote that. I thought you were just using her name as a pen name, but that you actually wrote it. Which doesn't really make sense, right? Why would you use a woman's name knowing how women are treated in the world of architecture? It would just make more sense to use his own name. But this assumption that Denise's work is actually Robert Vittori's work is something that begins to bother her very early in her career, and that she begins reacting to, for which she is ostracized. So the both of them go to Yale University, and famously they have the studio that they bring over to Las Vegas. So again, we have these 9 Ivy League architecture students, and they're hoping to go to Rome, to go to London, to go to the great cities to study architecture. But Robert Vittori and Denise Scott Brown, being the postmodernists that they are, decide to go against the grain, and they bring them to a city that is not necessarily known for architecture, and is actually sort of the laughing stock of the United States, Las Vegas. So they get here, they study the idea of the signage, building a city for the car, et cetera, the duck in the shed. And the people there are actually really happy to have them. Circus has just opened at this point. It's sort of like the most luxurious resort on the Strip. And the owner of Circus is so enthralled that Yale professors and students are in Las Vegas that he hosts a gala for them. And he specifically says how happy he is to have a female architecture professor in Las Vegas studying his casino. And out of this studio project comes the famous book, Learning from Las Vegas. And notice, 3 names are at the bottom: Robert Vittori, Denise Scott Brown, and who was person who was her GA at the time, or their assistant, Stephen Eisenhower. So it is the work of 3 professors and then 9 students. So total, we have 12 people who work on this together. And knowing what was going to happen, Robert Venturi writes a preface in which he says that they wrote this together. And notice he never says I in the entirety of the preface. He says we, our, together, our endeavors, we believe, our study, and so forth. And he specifically calls out Denise, and he says that the female Yale professor, meaning Denise, was actually so famous when she got to Vegas that they threw this whole gala in her honor. So very clearly, he is crediting who was responsible for writing this book. Now, when it was published, you can imagine that what happened was Robert Venturi got all the credit. All the critics were saying that he did this amazing job and that he had these revolutionary postmodern ideas. So in the revised edition, they rewrite the preface to it where they call out the critics and the media and architecture. And here she writes, Robert Venturi's note on attribution in the first edition was virtually ignored by almost all the reviewers. So she starts calling out the critics, and she says that architecture is being dominated by upper-class males and that the emphasis on its members' places is placed upon the architectural star system. So she begins attacking the system that is currently being upheld by most architects. And lastly, she says that the result of everything that has happened to her in light of learning from Las Vegas is that she writes this text called Sexism and the Star System in Architecture, otherwise known as Any Room at the Top. So on your exam next Thursday, one of the questions asks you to read that text and go through it. It's actually really interesting, so I heavily encourage you to go through all 3 of them and read them. To not do it would be a big disservice to yourself and to your career. I would even argue that they're more important than things like actually reading Learning from Las Vegas or things like 5 Points Towards a New Architecture, because while design manifestos are good and are important, it's equally important to read what the critics have to say and what the members of the profession have to say about being an architect in their time. So there's the article that she publishes. That's what you guys are going to be reading. Some of the points that she makes inside of here. So she says that this plan, which was for a city crosstown community, was designed by her and solely her. Robert Venturi only looked at this for like 2 hours. And in this article, she says that the review of his plan for the crosstown community suggests that Venturi is not so much affording his theory of development, blah, 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 blah. So they're praising his ideas, and then they say Venturi's position in relation to city planning is the thing that enables him to develop his basic posture. And in reaction, or in response to that, she says, this would be fine, except that the crosstown community was my work and was attributed as such in our book. So she specifically says it is hers. At no point does it say that it's Robert Venturi's. And then she says, I doubt whether over the period of 2 years that she worked on it, Bob spent just 2 afternoons actually looking at it. And yet it was attributed to him by almost every critic that saw the piece. So as a response, on all of the different publications and projects that they do, they specifically always have to say by Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, and they also begin listing all the other people that work in the firm, because they understand the importance of giving credit where credit is due. But critics continue to only name Robert Venturi as the star of the studio. Another case is this book. It's called Conversations with Architects, where we have a lot of the major names, including Louis Kahn. And essentially, it's a collection of essays on what it means to be an architect. And Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown are asked to participate. But what happens is when it comes time to make the cover, her name is left out entirely, so that there is a blank space between the architects and then the authors. And the editors come back to her and they say, sorry, if we add your name, it's just going to ruin the look of the book. To which there's 2 sort of questions that have to be asked. If you knew that you were going to be interviewing 9 architects, why didn't you just create a design that has 9 slots and then a space, and then you can put in your authors? And then the second thing that comes to mind is, Did they actually want Denise Scott Brown to even be in the book, right? Was it a deliberate choice to make sure that her name was not put on there? So after plenty of back and forth, they finally decide to add her name to it, but she is, at this point, beginning to have a lot of negative press around her, and she's beginning to be seen as an annoying woman that wants to put her name everywhere, and she ruined this beautiful, graphic design that should have basically had a space here where her name would have been. So do you guys think that including Denise Scott Brown's name ruined the graphic design of this book? Not really. And even if it did, you could have just asked your graphic designer, hey, can we just respace these, move it up a little bit and add an extra slot. It really was not that much extra work to do it. But they do begin to villainize her in the press, and now they begin saying Denise Scott Brown is the reason that Robert Venturi sucks. He was amazing before he married her, but she's bringing him down as an architect. So conversations around her begin to go very sour. The more vocal she gets, the more press or bad press that she gets to her name. And so eventually she decides that it's time to start speaking out. For a long time, she didn't want to be the person that was just, screaming in everyone's ears that sexism was a problem, until she has had absolutely enough of it and decides that if she's going to be villainized anyways, she might as well do it for the greater cause. So she participates in this thing called the AIA Alliance of Women in Architecture, which is essentially a symposium, like the Mayor Symposium, where you invited different women to talk about their experiences and how they can improve the conditions for other women in the future. And Denise Scott Brown says that she wanted men to be able to attend, but she knew what the implications of that would be. She knew that they were going to be there, that all the critics were going to arrive, and basically try to downplay what she was saying. So she says that she did make it a women's only event for that reason. Now the day of the event, she gets there, she starts giving her speech, and all the way in the back, she does have 6 architects, and some of them she recognized as some of her greatest critics pop up. And she knew that they were ready to fire at her. But as they started discussing things with the women in the crowd, all the women started agreeing with her and saying, I've experienced that too, we should do something about it, we need to change the way our profession is working. And she says that as the conference progressed, the 6 guys in the back just slowly retreated, and she never heard from them again. So we see that her efforts are sort of beginning to be received positively, at least by the women in the profession. And she claims in the text we're going to read, since then I've spoken at several conferences on women in architecture, and I've received inquiries of interest for deanship as a department chair several times in the year. So now architecture schools want her to come because they're realizing that she's actually this really powerful voice in the community. But she says that she finds herself on committees where she is the only woman and there is another black man. And she says that she believes that the both of them are essentially being used as tokens on the committee to say, look, we do accept women and we do accept people of color on here, even though the committees are made up of like 20 people and there's only 2 that are not, white male. And then she says that she's frequently invited to lecture architecture schools, and they always tell her that they want her to be a role model for their girls. But her reaction to that is that she would like to be invited, not because she's a woman, but because her work is actually interesting, because there is value to everything that she has done over the course of her career, including some of the architecture work that she does in conjunction with Robert Venturi, which I won't get into since you're familiar with them, but they become the sort of 2 founders of the postmodernist movement, the names that are most likely associated with that style. So in her text, she does discuss the star system, and she answers the question, how does one become a star? Which she says, you become a star by being named by another star. And what does a star look for in other stars? They essentially look for the same qualities that make them a star. So she is criticizing the award system in architecture for essentially being comprised of a very small group of people that all have the same ideas, and because of that they only award it to other people who have the same ideas. And so it's this very vicious cycle that doesn't allow any new ideas to break through into the profession. And there's no greater example of that than the famous Pritzker Prize controversy from 1991. right, so if you're not familiar, the Pritzker Prize is like the Oscars of architecture. It is the single most important award you could win as an architect. Once you have won this, you are basically going to be in all the history books. And it's only awarded to one individual every year. So some of the things that have been criticized about the Pritzker Prize are, first, how the winner is selected. So usually you have a jury around 10 to 12 people, and it's comprised of former winners, being stars, critics, writers, and occasionally a couple of academics. But when the prize was originally created, women could not sit on the jury until around 7 years later. And then last year, as in 2023, there were only 2 women on the 11-member jury. So to this day, it's not a very diverse panel, even though the profession is actually today 50-50 women and men in the United States and really around the world. So the selection process continues to pretty much just be made by former winners, or the stars. And the implications of this are, one, only an individual can receive this prize, meaning that if you are the head of a firm, it's not the firm that wins it, it is you as the principal that wins it. And the problem with that is that principals do not operate by themselves. In fact, most principals actually don't ever touch a lot of projects that go through their office. Principals are mostly responsible for forming relations, talking to clients, pitching projects. Pitching projects, and overall, they are in charge of building the social network to keep the firm running. It is the project managers, the draftsmen, and the designers that work in the firm that usually create all of these submissions. So by awarding it to the individual at the head of that firm and not the firm itself, you are essentially saying that that person did everything associated with that firm, which is a problem. And so it continues to uphold that myth of the singular creative genius. We'll talk about this when we get to the film lectures as well. For a long time, architects had this idea that if they weren't these struggling, single creative geniuses that put art above everything else, that they could never become great architects. And that's beginning to change today, right? There's lots of conversations about work-life balance, making the profession a little bit more modernized in terms of giving things like maternity leave to both men and women and not pushing people to be working more than 40 hours a week and so forth. But the Pritzker Prize continues to sort of uphold these ideas just by its selection process and the implications of its winners. So in 1991, Robert Montori is selected for this prize, and he responds to the Pritzker Committee and he says, I'll accept it, but you have to give it to me and Denise Scott Brown, because everything that you have awarded it to me for was done by the both of us. So it doesn't feel fair that you only give it to me. And the Pritzker Committee and him go back and forth, and their answer continues to be no. It's only for you and not for her. And so Denise Scott Brown ultimately decides to accept it for him. And she says, you know what, our firm needs the money, because it comes with $100,000. She says, we need the money, it would get us some more commissions. Overall, you know, sometimes the means justify the end, just accept it. So he does accept it in 1991. And what the jury has to say is, his biography on the Pritzker Prize website, first of all, says, Robert Montori's wife, Denise Scott Brown, is an architect, planner, author, and educator. She has been a partner in the firm since 1969, and they collaborated on books together. So even on the Pritzker website, they say that she was his partner throughout this whole process. And then in his acceptance speech, the jury citation before we get there, he does make a point, the jury makes a point of calling out all of the academic and practical work that they've done. So they say, few architects in the 20th century have been able to combine both aspects of the profession, and none have done so more successfully than Robert Montori. But let's recall that at this point, Denise Scott Brown was again the founder of an architecture program. She had lectured at 3 Ivy League universities. She'd written lots of texts that were attributed to Robert Montori. She was actually the writer in the partnership that he is now being praised for. And in his winning speech, he says, and last, you will notice during this loosely chronological description, I have used more and more the first person plural, that is we, meaning Denise and I. So even when he's accepting this prize, he does make it clear that that prize is not just his, but also hers. Now the Pritzker Prize, I introduced you the first day of class, starting with our first winner, Philip Johnson, up until our most recent winner. And it wasn't until 2004 that Miss Zaha Hadid was awarded this as the first woman and the only woman to date to win it by herself. Since then, we've had a couple other women sprinkled in the mix, but they're usually in partnerships of some sort. Robert Ventori is down here. So that's Robert, right? And notice Denise is right next to him. Now notice that a couple of years after he wins, we do have our first partnership awarded. So clearly the problem was not that it was two people getting the award, because they later broke that rule and allowed partnerships to be awarded. Then we have Zaha in 2004. And then in 2012, we have the situation repeat itself when, I am blanking on his name, I'm so sorry. He gets awarded the Pritzker Prize, and he is also a design duo with his wife. And he asks them to please name her as part of the Pritzker winner, and they say no. So today, only his name is on the website as well, despite all of their commissions being 50-50. And we also see that just 2 years prior, a partnership of two architects had been awarded. So, it does raise a lot of eyebrows. Why would you award one, couple, but not the other? Now, in 2014, the women of Harvard University are learning and they're unearthing all these materials. They're doing research on Denise Scott Brown, and they revisit this Pritzker Prize moment. And they decide to write to the committee, and they say, we think that you should add her retroactively. And Pritzker Prize responds and says, no, we can't do that because it's part of our rules. We can't change our rules. And so they respond to that saying, the rules of the Pritzker Prize are made by the Pritzker Prize, thus your refusal to not revisit the 1991 prize was a choice. And we saw that, right? In its list of winners, we saw that that was clearly a choice because at some point they allow it to partnerships. They allow it even to 3 people at some point and to male-female duos. So why can't they bend the rule to retroactively award it to Denise Scott Brown? They do say that they are deeply concerned that there is systematic bias in the awarding of the Pritzker Prize, which has led to the exclusion, particularly of women, and the prolonging of a myth of the lone male hero, which is exactly what Denise Scott Brown has been speaking out against for years. And then they do mention, here's her name, Lu Wenyu, who is the woman who was left out in 2012. They say that she should also be retroactively included 2 years later. So what does the Pritzker Prize do? They say that they are going to make a public announcement when they announce the winner of the 2014 prize, and when that time comes around, they don't say absolutely anything. And to date, Denise Scott Brown is not a Pritzker Prize winner. Now, another award system, sort of breaking out of Denise Scott Brown's story, is the AIA Gold Medal, which is the highest award that you can be given in the United States. And the AIA Gold Medal has always been awarded to people of notable contributions to the profession. It's been going on for a very long time, since like 1930-something. But it wasn't until 2014, the same year that the Pritzker Prize said no to Denise Scott Brown, that Julia Morgan was awarded that award. Does anyone remember from last Thursday's lecture who Julia Morgan is? What is her significance in the history of women in architecture? Yes?
She was the first woman admitted in the École.
In the École des Beaux-Arts?
Yeah.
Yes. Julia Morgan is the first woman to be able to attend the French Academy and becomes one of the first female architects in the United States. And it wasn't until around 70 years after she passed away that she was awarded anything. And since then, in 2016, in response to this whole Pritzker Prize controversy, AIA Gold Medal decides that they want to be the bigger person, and they decide that they want to award it to Denise Scott Brown and Robert Ventori. Since then, we have had another woman win that same award, but to date, there has not been a single woman that is still alive when she is receiving it that has gotten the AIA Gold Medal. Also on here, which we'll talk about next week, is the only African American to ever win the AIA Gold Medal, Paul Revere Williams, also given to him after he passed away. So no African American or woman has been given this award while they are alive. which says a lot about the system. At least not until 2023. I forgot about Ms. Carroll. Sorry, guys. Now, since then, this is what our numbers are looking like today as far as AIA membership breakdown. We're seeing that as we get closer to the present day, we do begin to have more and more women formulate a part of the Association of Architects. And interestingly, we're seeing that today the relationship has sort of flipped, and the number of people obtaining licensure are actually flipping to being more women, which is a good thing, right? Having a license means you can practice on your own, you can open a firm, you do not have to operate underneath another architect's name. And today, more than a quarter of US architects are women, right? So slowly we're seeing that this gap is beginning to close. And though in academia, universities, it's usually 50-50 at this point, we still see this really major gap where we see women do enter the profession, they do work in offices, but they just don't get licenses as often. But when we see graphs like these, we see that that gap is slowly going to begin to close until eventually we do have a 50-50 in terms of who is a licensed architect in the United States. So, in Denise Scott Brown's story, we see that the female architect has now become fully realized as an advocate for herself. She's not doing it just for herself, she's also doing it for the other women in her profession, and she's always been very vocal about that up until a couple of years ago. If you look at the SOA lobby, when you guys walk in, there's all these photographs that say from Venice to Venice through the eyes of Denise Scott Brown. All of that is part of her legacy in the world of architecture. But keep in mind that in order for her to pave that way, she was criticized, ridiculed, excluded, and ignored by critics of her time, and to date, the Pritzker Prize continues to ignore her contributions. So we'll see if that eventually changes one day, but it is thanks to these 7 women that we have looked at that women today are finally being recognized as equals in the world of architecture. Now, I want to give you guys a personal story of mine that happened a couple years ago to show you that in some ways, there are still people around that hold these really, really old ideas. So when I was a 4th year, our first project was to make a canopy for a beach, like a shade structure. And the requirements were that it had to be able to be taken down and then built up somewhere else when the exhibition was over. So I came up with this proposal. I won't talk too much about it, but essentially it's these light tubes that have a film so that when the sun comes through them, it creates a play of colors on the ground inspired by the jewel tones of the Pacific. And then as the sun moves, because they're in different angles, they would essentially catch the tubes at different times. So the patterns on the ground would change. It is all made out of steel so that you can take it down. You can see I documented how to build these little modules, and then you can transport it and reduce the carbon footprint of transportation costs. So we're presenting these. I think I'm like the 3rd person to present, and one of my jurors said that the idea was okay, but that it was really more of an interior design endeavor and that this wasn't real architecture. And at the time, I just remember I felt really upset about it. I didn't think too much about it, but that juror then went on to praise a lot of my classmates at the time, the guys who had designed these huge concrete structures. And though they were great, right, they looked really pretty as well, the issue that I had with them was that you couldn't move them. When you cast concrete in place, if you're going to put it somewhere else, that means you have to demolish all that concrete, which has a huge environmental implication, and then you have to recast it wherever you place it again. But that juror was really enamored with all of those pieces, and he did, reduce mine to something being interior design, which to me doesn't make any sense because this isn't even like on the interior of anything. It's a freestanding structure, and everything about it is clearly articulated. Now, at the end of that review, the rest of the jury had to award 1 or 2 of them as their favorites. They did end up selecting me. He was pretty quiet about it, but I did just want to share that example with you to show that even in today's juries, as students, and even out there on the field, once you start having clients, there will be people that will make certain comments that, although are not blatantly sexist, do have those implications that women are more interior designers, they create more beautiful artistic things, but that they aren't really architects.